What would you do if your HOA tried to sue you for owning too much land? I never thought I'd find myself standing on my own porch, holding a stack of legal papers, with Karen Wilkins smirking like she had just personally delivered my death sentence. Yet, there she was, arms folded across her pastel power suit, tapping a manicured finger against her clipboard as if she had already won. "I suggest you read those carefully, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with the condescension of a woman who had never been told no in her life. I glanced down at the lawsuit. Excessive land ownership. Violation of community harmony. It was so absurd I almost laughed. Almost. Because the terrifying part wasn't that Karen had filed this lawsuit. It was that she actually believed she could win. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. I was dealing with a full-blown suburban tyrant. Karen Wilkins had been a nightmare since the day I moved in. With her peroxide blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, and wardrobe of coordinated pastel sets, she ruled this neighborhood like her own personal kingdom. The HOA board wasn't just a committee, it was her royal court, blindly enforcing whatever ridiculous rule she dreamed up. Within my first week, I'd been hit with citations for everything from my mailbox being too modern to my grass being the wrong shade of green. But this lawsuit? This was a whole new level of insanity. I flipped through the pages, feeling my frustration build. My lawyer friend, Ryan Carter, leaned over, scanning the document with an amused chuckle. "She's actually claiming you're violating an HOA land limit policy," he said, shaking his head. "That's not a thing, Ethan. That's not how land ownership works." "That's what I thought," I muttered, watching Karen stride away, her heels clicking against my driveway with the confidence of a woman who had never lost a battle. But something felt off. She wasn't just making a scene. She wasn't just stirring up trouble for fun. She was too smug. Either Karen was completely delusional, or she knew something I didn't. I spent the next few days buried in research, trying to make sense of the ridiculous lawsuit Karen had thrown at me. The more I read, the more it became clear, there was no HOA rule about land size restrictions. Nothing. Not a single clause, amendment, or precedent that justified her claim. Which meant one of two things: either Karen was completely bluffing, or she had something hidden up her sleeve. That unsettling thought gnawed at me as I combed through every HOA document I could find. And then, I saw it, buried in the meeting minutes from 2 weeks before she handed me the lawsuit. A new amendment. One that limited the size of privately owned lots, and it had been added after I had already bought my property. My stomach tightened as I read the fine print. There had been no vote, no community discussion. Just a quiet little update slipped into the bylaws, right before she sued me. I clenched my jaw. She had rewritten the rules just to target me. When I confronted her at the next HOA meeting, she didn't even bother hiding it. She stood at the front of the room, arms folded, her usual smug expression firmly in place. "Rules evolve, Ethan," she said with a shrug. "It's called progress. You should try keeping up." I gritted my teeth as murmurs spread through the room. Some of the board members looked uncertain, but no one dared challenge her. I wanted to argue, wanted to call her out in front of everyone, but I knew that wouldn't do me any good. Karen had stacked the deck in her favor. She had the HOA wrapped around her perfectly manicured finger. If I was going to win this fight, I needed something bigger. That's when I decided to dig deeper. If Karen could play dirty, I could play smart. For the next few nights, I pored over old property records, zoning laws, and every legal document tied to my land. I was looking for a loophole, an angle, something that would turn the tables on her. And that's when I found it. I nearly choked on my coffee when I read the deed. Karen thought she had all the power. She thought she could rewrite the rules, bend the HOA to her will, and push me out of my own home. But what she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I owned something she desperately needed. The land the HOA office was sitting on. It belonged to me. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. But after checking the records 3 times, it all made sense. Years ago, when I bought my property, the land had come bundled with an additional parcel. It had once been owned by a real estate developer, long before the HOA existed. Somehow, over the years, the HOA had started using the office building on that land without ever realizing they were technically renting it from me. I sat back in my chair, stunned. This was my checkmate. But instead of rushing in guns blazing, I decided to play the long game. Karen wanted a war. I'd let her think she was winning. I'd let her drown herself in her own arrogance. And then, when she least expected it, I'd drop the hammer. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was doubling down. The next morning, I woke up to a city inspector on my property. "Sir, we've received multiple complaints about your home violating code regulations," he said, flipping through a clipboard. I narrowed my eyes. "From who?" He didn't answer, but I already knew. I watched as he walked around my property, snapping pictures of my driveway, my siding, even my bird feeder. The whole thing felt like a bad joke, until I saw something that made my blood boil. At the edge of my property, just out of sight, Karen was watching. And not just watching, talking. Whispering. And then, I saw it. A thick envelope discreetly passed from her hand to the inspectors. She wasn't just using the HOA to harass me. She was bribing officials to make my life hell. I clenched my fists as the inspector turned back to me, already scribbling down violations. This wasn't a simple neighborhood dispute anymore. Karen was playing dirty, and now, she had crossed the line into corruption. She thought she had power. She thought she could bulldoze me into submission. She had no idea that she had just walked straight into her own downfall. 2 weeks later, the courthouse was packed. I arrived early, dressed in my usual jeans and a button-down, while my lawyer, Ryan Carter, adjusted his tie with the calm confidence of a man who had seen every ridiculous lawsuit imaginable. Across the room, Karen Wilkins sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. But Karen? She was thriving. She had come dressed for battle, her pastel power suit freshly pressed, a massive binder labeled "Evidence Against Ethan Walker," sitting in front of her like it contained the secrets of the universe. She flipped through the pages with an air of self-importance, shooting me a victorious smirk every few seconds, as if she had already won. I leaned over to Ryan. "She actually thinks this is going to work." He chuckled. "That's what makes this so much fun." The judge, an older man who looked like he had suffered through one too many petty suburban disputes, took his seat and sighed. "Let's get this over with." Karen launched into her speech before he even finished adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, this community prides itself on order and balance, but Mr. Walker has disrupted that harmony with his excessive land ownership. His property size is an abuse of space, a blatant disregard for neighborhood standards, and a selfish land grab that threatens our way of life." The judge held up a hand, looking already exhausted. "Ms. Wilkins, you're claiming that Mr. Walker is violating an HOA land limit policy?" Karen's expression brightened. "Exactly. And where in the HOA bylaws does it say private homeowners have a land limit?" The room fell silent. Karen's confident smirk faltered for the first time. She flipped through her massive binder, flipping pages frantically, as if a real rule would magically appear. "Well, Your Honor, the bylaws were updated recently to reflect the community's best interests," she said, her voice losing just a bit of its edge. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Updated how?" Ryan leaned forward, tapping the papers in front of him. "Your Honor, my client's property has been the same size since the day he bought it. This so-called land limit policy was added after he already owned his land. It wasn't voted on. It wasn't approved by the community. It was secretly inserted by Ms. Wilkins herself. Karen's head snapped up. That's a baseless accusation. The judge rubbed his temples. Ms. Wilkins, do you have any legal basis for this lawsuit? Karen opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. And then, finally, the realization hit her. She had nothing. The judge sighed, looking like he was deeply regretting his life choices. A mess. Wilkins, you cannot sue someone for legally owning land. A ripple of suppressed laughter spread through the room. Karen went rigid, her carefully rehearsed confidence shattering like glass. Your Honor, if I could just... Case dismissed, the judge interrupted, already moving on to the next file. Just like that, it was over. Karen sat frozen, gripping her binder like a life raft. The HOA board members beside her were slowly inching away, as if trying to distance themselves from the train wreck unfolding in real time. I stood up, feeling Karen's eyes burning into me as I buttoned my jacket. Outside the courthouse, she was waiting. Her hands were clenched into fists, her expression twisted into something between fury and disbelief. This isn't over, she hissed. You don't belong in this neighborhood. I took my time slipping on my sunglasses, letting her stew in her own anger. Then, I grinned. Karen, I think you're going to love what comes next. And with that, I walked away, leaving her standing there, seething. The next morning, I woke up to find a fresh stack of violation notices taped to my front door. Unauthorized bird feeding. Driveway width irregularities. Exterior paint clashing with seasonal aesthetics. The same color I'd had for years. It wasn't enough that she had lost, Karen wanted revenge. And judging by the sheer insanity of these new citations, she was just getting started. By the end of the week, I had collected so many violation notices that I could have wallpapered my entire living room with them. Karen was relentless. Every morning, a new list of manufactured offenses appeared on my door. My trash cans were half an inch too far from the curb, my porch light was excessively bright, and my personal favorite, unauthorized possession of wind chimes. She was throwing everything she could at me, hoping something, anything, would stick. But the real show began when she announced an emergency HOA meeting, conveniently scheduled to discuss the threat I posed to the neighborhood. I made sure to arrive early. The HOA office was packed. Most of the attendees looked either bored, confused, or mildly irritated that they had been dragged into another one of Karen's crusades. She stood at the front, clipboard in hand, radiating the smug confidence of a woman who had never faced real opposition. As many of you know, she began, her voice dripping with faux concern, our neighborhood thrives on order, harmony, and respect for our community values. But recently, she paused for dramatic effect, her eyes locking onto me. We've had a homeowner who refuses to abide by those values. Murmurs spread through the room. A few heads turned my way. A man in the back, George Simmons, one of the older residents, scratched his head. Wait, what exactly did he do? Karen's jaw tightened. She had expected blind support, not questions. He owns too much land, she said, as if that alone should have been a crime. Silence. A woman near the front, Linda Harris, frowned. Is that a rule? It should be, Karen muttered. That was all I needed. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment stretch before speaking. Karen, I said slowly, if my land is such a problem, why don't you buy it from me? Her mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. What? I shrugged. If my property is so disruptive, you should be willing to make me an offer. I'll even give you a discount. The entire room turned to Karen. Waiting. She had no response, because the truth was painfully simple. She didn't want my land. She wanted control. Her face darkened. That's not the point. I smirked. Then what is? The meeting fell apart after that. People started questioning her motives. Some of her usual supporters looked uneasy. Even the HOA board members, who had always followed her blindly, seemed less certain. Karen had lost control of the narrative. And that's when I decided it was time to drop the hammer. 2 days later, I invited Karen and the entire HOA board to a special meeting at the HOA office. I made sure to be there early, sipping my coffee as they all filed in. Karen arrived last, still wearing her usual air of superiority, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She didn't like that she didn't know what was coming. I waited until everyone was seated before placing a neatly printed document on the table. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is the deed to this land." Karen's brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward. "I own this land." I let the words sink in. "The land your HOA office sits on? It's mine." For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then someone let out a disbelieving laugh. One of the board members, flipping through the document, went pale. Karen, however, did not laugh. She was staring at me as if I had just sprouted a second head. "That's impossible. The HOA owns this office." I slid the deed across the table. "No, Karen. I do. And I've been nice enough to let you use it for free. But given recent events, I've been reconsidering my generosity." Her face went white. You can't do this." I leaned back. "I can." I smiled. "And I am." Chaos erupted in the room. Board members started talking over each other, flipping through the document, double-checking the details, realizing they had been renting land from me for years without even knowing it. Karen sat frozen, her entire illusion of power unraveling before her eyes. One of the board members, Linda Harris, cleared her throat. "I think we should listen to him," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not getting kicked out of this office because of a personal vendetta." Others murmured in agreement. Karen, still silent, clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had lost. She knew it. But I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't done yet. As the meeting wrapped up, and the board members slowly filed out, Karen lingered behind. She stood there, her entire body tense, glaring at me like a cornered animal. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice low and furious. I smirked. "Oh, Karen," I said, grinning. "It's just getting started." The moment Karen stormed out of that meeting, I knew she wouldn't go down quietly. People like her never do. She had built her entire reign on the illusion of control, and now that it had been ripped away, she would do anything, to claw it back. The next morning, an official-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox. I opened it, already expecting something ridiculous, but even I had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Karen was countersuing me for emotional damages. Apparently, my legally owned property had caused her significant distress, enough that she believed she was entitled to financial compensation. Ryan nearly choked on his coffee when I showed him the lawsuit. "She's suing you because you own land," he said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "This won't even make it to court." And he was right. No judge in their right mind would take this seriously. But Karen wasn't trying to win in court anymore, she was playing a public game. Within days, rumors spread like wildfire. She went door to door, handing out dramatic pamphlets with headlines like, "Save Our Neighborhood," and "Stop the Land Baron." She painted herself as a tragic victim, twisting the truth into some warped tale where I was the villain, an outsider trying to dismantle the community. Some people bought into it. There are always those who would rather be spoon-fed nonsense than think for themselves. I caught suspicious glances at the grocery store, hushed whispers that stopped the second I walked by. But most of the neighborhood? They weren't falling for it. Because then, the real scandal broke. Someone, and I swear it wasn't me, dug into Karen's financial records. And what they found? Pure gold. For years, Karen had been misusing HOA funds, funneling money into personal vacations, home renovations, even a luxury spa membership. The woman who had spent years nickel-and-diming homeowners over minor violations had been bleeding them dry the entire time. And the best part? She had been sloppy about it. The records were a mess, filled with blatant inconsistencies and unapproved expenses. The moment the news hit the neighborhood forums, it was over. Karen tried to fight it. She called an emergency meeting to defend herself, but the second she walked in, people were already waiting with paperwork. An official audit had been launched. The HOA was under investigation. She stood at the podium, her voice cracking under the weight of her unraveling empire. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered. "I have always acted in the best interest of this community." From the back, a man shouted over her. "Then why'd you spend HOA money on a 5-star hotel in Maui?" A woman held up a stack of old violation notices. "Are you going to pay back the thousands you stole from us?" Karen's face twisted into something desperate, something almost feral. She turned to me, her last lifeline, her last attempt to shift the blame. "This is your fault," she spat. "You started this." I smiled. "No, Karen. You did." And with that, it was over. The HOA collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Residents voted to dissolve it entirely, freeing the neighborhood from Karen's reign of terror. As for the HOA office? Let's just say I had other plans. I had the eviction notice drafted just for the satisfaction of it. Watching Karen shove her belongings into a cardboard box, her face twisted in rage, was the kind of poetic justice you couldn't script better. She put her house up for sale a week later. Rumor had it she moved to another neighborhood, one with an even stricter HOA. Some people never learn. As for me, I celebrated the only way that made sense. I threw the biggest block party the neighborhood had ever seen. No permits. No fines. No ridiculous HOA rules. Just good food, good music, and an entire community breathing a collective sigh of relief. And the best part? The old HOA office? I turned it into a community barbecue joint. Free for the neighborhood. Open to anyone who wanted to enjoy a meal, without fear of getting fined for it. I sat back, beer in hand, watching as the neighborhood finally felt like a place people actually wanted to live in. And for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it should be. But it makes me wonder, have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.